Hello, and welcome again to A Window into Worlds, a world building workshop. This is round 2 for this session because apparently it wasn't picking up any of the slides from before. Probably because I don't actually have PowerPoint on this computer and I'm using some kind of viewer. We're going to see if it works this time. Fortunately, we didn't get very far. All we've been discussing is recapping last week, talking about how most people start with a story and then they work their way through the story and create the world based off of the way the story goes. Whether that story is starting in a small town and working its way out, or starting in a larger city. In our case, we're starting with the universe and working our way inward. So we're going to discuss creating our universe, then the world, and then all of the things that make up the world. The continents, the countries, the individual cities, towns, fortresses, watchtowers, everything along the way. It's really important to note for anyone who's here that is going to be DMing, that's a dungeon master, you may already have a set universe and world that you are crafting your story and world in. So you have to be careful with that. If you're using something like World of Darkness or Dungeons and Dragons as a system and creating your own world, that's great. This is totally for you. If you are basing it in an actual world that already exists, you need to plan accordingly. If you're a role player and you're playing somewhere that already exists, Azeroth, Tamriel, you need to try and be reasonable. It's really hard for role players who don't understand your headcanon of what you're doing, and that's why there are so many disputes and people disagreeing. The universe is huge. It's ridiculously huge. And I'm not expecting you to create every little planet and moon and sun and every star and make it something huge. If you're doing a sci-fi, that's great. I think you should do as many as you possibly can. But the whole point is to have a big area to work with and to give yourself room to grow. When I say the universe, I'm referring to the world that your world exists. It's completely up to you to establish this. If there's a lot of different planets, then they may or may not need your care right now. We're going to talk about creating and how you need to leave yourself room to grow. It's a great idea to go ahead and start establishing some places and naming them, but you really don't have to work on creating this enormous scale of a project. Just think about your world, where it fits in this universe and how this universe came to be. That's the most important part. If you're writing about an alternate reality, you're probably still going to be focused on Earth, and it's just a different timeline. So it's completely up to you and how you are writing your story and the story it takes place. There's a lot of questions that you need to ask when you're doing this. You need to figure out, how did this universe and this world come about? Was it created by a god? Was it created through some sort of look at Hitchhiker's Guide to the Universe, which we quoted in an earlier slide. They talk about rebooting the Earth, essentially. They bring it from a backup after it's been destroyed. It's that sort of thing. You have to figure out where the world comes from and how it was created. You have to think about the beliefs of the people that lived there. Not everybody's going to agree. You're going to have some people that believe one way, and you have other people who believe that this is how it was done, and of course they clash. That happens in our world all the time. You can ask 100 people, and chances are that they're all going to disagree on how the Earth was created. And it's no different from any other world. Every world is going to have some sort of dissension and alternating beliefs, and we're going to talk about those in detail later. But for now, this is where you're establishing the foundation. And you need to figure out where it was when it was started and where it is now. Religion or faith, or the lack of it, is really the strongest foundation for creating a world. When you see a lot of cities in fiction and in reality, a temple or a church of some sort is very often the first structure that's built. They are what hold the community together. It's why groups of people have an exodus to completely leave a country. It is the foundation that they build upon when they move into a new area and settle. So that is the best place to start. If you want to start with a god creating your world, that's a really good, solid start. But there is a process for this. And like I said, you need to give yourself room to grow. You might have a small story now, but it might get huge. And you might have another book planned later on down the road. One book becomes 3 books, becomes 4 books, and all of a sudden you have a huge series on your hand. So just keep it simple at first. Just get a physical form going. Give yourself lots of room. Once you have that started, you can start plotting out your paths. With a story, with a book, you usually have a starting line and you have the finish line. Think of where those are. Find them and start the process of getting from the point A to point B and marking little things along the way. If you know that your character starts in a desert, but eventually they end up in this capital city in a rainforest, then you need to make that path of how they get from one place to the other. If you're a dungeon master, you're going to have multiple paths. You don't want your people to have a set place. You want to give them choices. You can tempt them with certain paths that they can take, but you want to make sure that they have freedom. Once you have everything established, you just fill in the gaps by breathing life into your world with all the smaller details. Before we start on the maps, does anybody have anything that they want to ask? I will say that I have added slides to this presentation today, and I did not have a printout that is up to date. So I'm kind of guessing on what comes up. It's a surprise for everybody. Okay, we're gonna jump into the maps, which is a pretty overwhelming ordeal. And we're gonna talk about basically geography, because like I said in the first one, world building is just utilizing all your social studies skills. And geography is the most important part of this process. I made this map using a world map maker, and I've got a shortened URL at the bottom of the screen that you can follow. It is a little odd to use at first. The first time I used it, I tried saving and it didn't work, and I lost all my progress. But each section is divided on a grid, and you can turn and choose outlines that are appropriate. You can also generate a random world map and work from that. Or if you have one in mind, you of course can make it yourself. It's, like I said, it's a little difficult to use. It takes some getting used to, but I really like it. When I was looking for something like this, it was the only one I found that really met my needs and what I liked and it's probably the best one that I have found. There are tons out there. There's lots of software that you can get. This is a free website. You can just open it in a browser, and then you can save your picture as a paint file and do whatever you want with it. Now this is the boring part, unless you really like geography, is we have to think of all the different geographical features. We're going to talk about different types of land and area and bodies of water, and there's really a lot that you can go on. So when we talk about land, you want to have as many of these features as you can, as long as they're reasonable. You don't have to have every type of climate and biome that exists in the world. It's completely unnecessary. A lot of worlds have mountain ranges. Not everybody has a volcano. So you just want to use what you need. If you have a desert, you're going to have some dunes, you're going to have oases. If you have grasslands, some of those are cultivated, some of them are agricultural. A lot of it depends on the societies that exist in your world. If you have an agricultural society or hunters and gatherers, you're going to have areas where they can farm, and you're going to have areas where they can hunt and gather. If you have a hunter-gatherer society that's living in this completely barren tundra, they're going to have a really hard time, and that could make for a great story, or it could be a pain. So you have to figure out what you need and what your people need. And of course, water. The world is made up of an enormous amount of water. Most of the world is water. Your world doesn't have to have any water, but you're going to be in a pickle if you do that. So it depends on what kind of society you have and what kind of lands you have. Maybe your world has a lot of oceans. Maybe there are fjords, which are beautiful. There's a lot of different things you have to consider, and you have to name them. Rivers should have names. They're essential to communities, and they may be historically important too, and we'll talk about that later. Of course, the most common thing to consider is forests, because there's a lot of different types of forests, and they are where you have all of your flora and your fauna, and they're where you have all your resources and your supplies. So you need to plan those accordingly and have them in appropriate climates. I'm not going to give you a geography lesson. You obviously know how to use Google and can figure out the types of climates and vegetation that all of these forests have. But I thought I would put in a breakdown. If you're going to have an area that's got long winters, you're going to have a lot of evergreens, and you're going to have a lot of fir trees. If you're going to have somewhere that has all the seasons, you're going to have trees like maples and oaks and birches. You don't have to call them this if you want to create a new botanical system. You're going to name the plants accordingly. So it's completely up to you. And like I said, this isn't a geography lesson. You're going to have to look up this stuff on your own. But I wanted to give you some ideas and give you some things to think about. One of the things I really like is wetlands. I feel like it's not always included, and last year I visited a swamp and a mangrove, and they're just really rich environments, and there's a lot to them. Mangroves smell horribly if you've never been to a mangrove. Maybe some people like that, but the salt water is terrible, but they have fascinating trees and plants, and swamps are gorgeous. If you've never been to a swamp sanctuary, I really encourage you to go. Any type of area that you're going to include, if you have the ability to visit it, you should go, because there's a very different atmosphere than what you might be expecting. When I hear swamp, I always thought of lots of mosquitoes, and I thought of smells, and I thought of a really unpleasant environment. But it's actually really wonderful. It's it doesn't smell, period. It just smells like nature, and it's not bad at all. It's very populated with trees. There's a lot of vegetation on the water. Of course, you have different animals that live there. You get to see alligators and different kinds of flowers that you wouldn't normally see, orchids. It's beautiful. It's a wonderful environment. Mangroves, on the other hand, I don't see how anyone could love it. I stayed at a resort that had a beach that you had to walk through mangroves to get to, and you could take a little cart that went by, and my friend and I decided to walk, and that was the biggest mistake that I have ever made. I don't deal well with sunlight anyway, and to walk through all those smelly mangroves was not fun. It wasn't a good time. They're neat, but they were only neat for the first 5 minutes. And of course, insects is a big thing. And I'm not a big fan of insects. So here's the same map that we saw earlier with just a few geographical features. We've got a mountain range in the northwest. We've got some trees, and we've got some cliffs and some caves, and we've got the starts of a desert. So it's not drastically different. This is just putting some things on the board. Now that we have that, we can start thinking about the people of our world. We've got all our trees, we've got all of our climate, our happy little clouds and our happy little trees, and probably a lot of happy mistakes. But now we have to worry about all the people who live here. And there's probably going to be a lot of people here. You don't normally write a story that has one group of people. It doesn't very often happen unless you have a specific thing that happened to all the other races and groups of people. So you have to consider how these people settle, how they adapt to their surroundings, and how they are going to adjust to the areas you put them in. People who live in a desert have a completely different way of life. They have a completely different system. They know exactly what they're doing, and they do it splendidly, and I admire them. People who live in a mountain range area, they have a lot of things to be concerned about: avalanches, temperatures, everything they have to adapt to. Not only that, but they impact the environment. If you have a city that is an industrial manufacturer, they are going to have a major impact on the environment. They might have a chemical spill. They might have an enormous amount of waste. And you have to think about how that's going to affect your world. If you have a chemical spill, how do people react? If you've never been in an area where that is an issue, we had a chemical spill in the state I live in recent years, and everyone was without fresh water. People couldn't go to school. It had a major impact on the society and the environment, and people were actually packing up and going to stay in hotels further away. People in my city wasn't affected, but people in my city were taking up enormous amounts of bottles of water to donate to those people who didn't have any fresh water. And it's really terrible. We depend on our rivers and our reservoirs, and when they're polluted, we don't know what to do. We have to have fallbacks. And of course you have to, like I said earlier, think about the type of culture you're going to have. If you have a Bedouin tribe that lives in the desert, then they're going to be living accordingly. And then, of course, not only do you have to worry about their relationships with the land, you have to worry about their relationships with other people. And again, we're going to talk about interaction between the groups of people later. because they have an enormous impact on each other, and it's not always good. So now that we have our geography and we have places established, you can see that structures have started to come up and we've started to fill in a little bit more. Well, we know that this capital city is here in the middle where all of these coniferous trees are. Deciduous trees. So we've got those, and maybe it's surrounded by maples. Now, of course, if you're going to build a city, you tend to destroy the environment around the area so you can build it. So you have to make sure to keep that in mind. A lot of people don't build a castle in a completely empty field. They're going to build it in an area where they're going to have to clear a lot of trees. Now, they might plant those trees back, but it takes a lot of time for them to grow back. So timelines come into play there, just like we discussed in the first session. Now the fun part comes. Before we start this, does anybody have any questions at all? Because this is where it gets frustrating. Mal mentioned in the chat that one of the members of RPHQ loves mangroves, but that member also really loves bugs, so I don't know how much I trust him. So now we're going to talk about naming places. And a lot of times when you think of names, a lot of times you'll think of a name before you actually think of the type of place that you're going to tie it to. But you really need to have some sort of theme or system that you're going to use. And you're going to have to think about the world that your story is taking place in. They're going to be divided into either archaic, modern, present-day names, or future names. So you have to consider which one of those themes fits your story first, and they might overlap a little bit. And I've got a little handout here, I'll leave that on the screen for just a second, that I made when I did this workshop in person, and you can just go there and it's a little PDF explaining naming systems. So first we're going to start on archaic names. These are names that sometimes are considered older. They're considered an older system, but they still exist today. They're still a great way to name things. It makes complete sense. These names are usually named for people, for the purpose that place served, or the type of environment that it exists in. So when I say people, we're talking gods, we're talking to deities, the founders of the city, or even as important figures. The city that I work in is named for the man who built the railroad system there. There are cities that are settled by a certain group of people, and whoever they elect as their mayor, he is who the city is named after. Or when you have deities, you have places like Athens, or Sparta, and you have all these places that are named after gods and goddesses. And even earlier when we were talking about types of forests, boreal forest, that's named for a deity. So you have to think about all these different things, and this is really the easiest way to go about it, is to name a place after a god or a person who is important to the society. You have to think about the purpose of a place. Why does this place exist? And once you establish that, then you can think about names that fit it. So if you have a town that is a popular stopover for traveling merchants, say everyone stops at this town to rest before going into the main capital city. Maybe it will be called Traveler's Rest or something along those lines. If it's a watchtower, you might call it, you might name it after a guard captain. You have places just like this in pretty much every game that you'll play. You'll see, for example, in Elder Scrolls Online, Davin's Watch. And you'll see lots of those throughout. Sometimes you'll have a lot of towns that you think, well, where the heck did this name come from? And if you look into the lore, a lot of times you can find it. When you have the island of Bleak Rock, and you think about why is it called Bleak Rock? Because it's awful. Because it's a very snowy area in Nord territory, and it looks bleak. And it's just an island, pretty much. So it's a bleak rock in the middle of the ocean. And that's where you get physical location names. So Westport, it's a town on the west coast. It's probably got some docks where people can come in and trade. Blackmarsh, it's a wetlands, and it's dark and it's shady. And it seems kind of like a no-brainer to choose these names. But it's always been this way. You have, in like Diablo, they mention Reaper's March, and they have, or in Elder Scrolls you have Reaper's March. And then you have places like Kingsport and Diablo. You have places that are named for what they are and where they are. So now that we're past the archaic, we'll talk about modern naming conventions. And these a lot of times follow the same things. They're named for people. A lot of different sports teams, a company CEO, a politician, someone who has a lot of money and they're throwing it around. Almost every city in the US, you start looking up, why is it named this? It's named that because of somebody. There's just tons of places that are named after rich people or people who have settled them. Maybe it's named for a war that happened there. A lot of times the wars are named for the places they're fought, but maybe in your place, in your world, something happened and they changed the name of that place. For example, in my world that I've created that I referenced in the first one, I have a mountain range that I called the Betrayer's Ramparts. And that is where essentially a former antagonist had made his base. And that is where he kind of held his ground against some enemies. So you have places like that. And then of course there's branding. You can have sponsors naming your place. The London Eye has been named after pretty much whoever sponsors it. Madame Tussauds, I think Coca-Cola was one. Basically whoever's funding it at the time, that's what it's called. I couldn't even tell you what it's called right now. It's been the Millennium Eye and the London Eye and the Millennium Wheel. It's hard to tell what it even is right now because it's had about 7 different names. Maybe it's named after what used to be there. This is really popular in subdivisions, and it's almost like a joke. But when you're clearing a forest for a housing development, a lot of them tend to name the streets after the trees that were cleared out. So you have things like Elm Street or Maple Drive. They do it with birds, so you have like Quail Drive and Sparrow Lane, and it's really common to name them after that. I've seen it more in housing developments than I have in anything else, and it's a little comical and it's a little sad at the same time, but it's what happens. Now, when you're thinking of a futuristic name, if you're doing a sci-fi, if your story takes place in the future, you have so much room to play with. You can use the past naming conventions, you can use modern naming conventions, you can make up your own. It all depends on the kind of world that you're creating and the type of setting that you have. If it's an alternate reality, you might do something different by changing the name just slightly. So, say you're writing a story that's like a alternate reality London, and you call it Ladonia or something like that, or New Germania. You just change it a little bit and make sure that it fits the lore. In Doctor Who, they have New York, and David Tennant's Doctor jokes about how it's actually should be like New York, like 7 times over because it's changed so many times, and time travels, of course, so it's hard to keep track. So maybe for your sci-fi, places are just named after numbers or named after like bases. If it takes place in space, you might have station number 13, and within station number 13 you have level 5 and level 6, and someone might be from Pod A, level 6 on station number 47. It depends on the type of world that you have, and you need to make sure that it fits. So now that we have names, we can actually start placing them. And we want to make sure that we leave some room. So you can see that we have the Iron Peaks, where there was just a few mountains. There's some ruins up there, so something must have happened. There might have been a battle, or it might have been a city that just kind of fell apart. Where the cliffs are, there's some small little land masses that are going out to the ocean. We called that the Swallowed Centuries because maybe there were some watchtowers and lighthouses there and a small village on the coast. But because it's so ancient, the tides came in, they weren't prepared for living on the ocean's shore, and the whole town was swallowed up. We've got Siren's Grotto in the south. We've got a lot of different caves and hollows and grottos there, and I absolutely love the grottos that you see in certain games, because I don't really think about them very often until I started playing Elder Scrolls, and there's so many different caves that you can go in that are just public dungeons or whatever, and they have just gorgeous environments, and you can have an entire city in one, and it's something that I would like to see happen more. Our 2 watchtowers we've named after esteemed guards, men that have protected the area. We've got Reeves Vigil and Corrigan's Watch. Then they protect the roads between the capital, which I have left unnamed on purpose, and the village of Perrinshire. Perrinshire, I just picked the name sort of like a play off of the Welsh word for woods, and that's because it is surrounded by woods. They probably have an agricultural community there too, with smaller farms, but they are very clearly surrounded by woods and lakes. Further to the east, you have the Broken Coast, and I just named it that because we have all these rivers that are coming in from the ocean. And then, of course, north we have Sidhaven, which is in a marsh area, and it's probably got docks on the coast as well. The island in the middle, it's very sparsely populated. We just called it Karga's Nest. Maybe there's a prophetess that lives there, and someone that people will travel to learn wisdom from. And of course, far to the east, we have Port Tusneem. We've got a nice oasis for them, and we've got the Howling Dunes in the south. So we've got this world that I tried to make it pretty well balanced. I think just looking at it, you can kind of tell it's more of a medieval fantasy environment. But it doesn't have to be. It's just kind of what's expected by looking at these icons. Now, I'm going to be kind of closing out with some other example maps just to show my progression of how I did my world. I threw this warning up here because it starts out really calm, and then it gets a little out of hand because you can see my process on how I've worked it out. When I created this world, I said in the first session that I just had a dream, and I just kind of created a world around it. When I started making the map, I didn't actually know what I was going for. I didn't know what all I needed because I didn't know where the story necessarily went. I had a general idea. I had a few places in mind that I wanted to include. But I really started with this map, only I had probably about 7 or 8 more islands on it as well. And I ended up cutting those out. So this is the second draft after I've removed all of those, and I've added some bridges to connect the continents. This is the next draft. I did this more as a visual aid to myself. It was after I had filled in names. It's very messy. I used calligraphy pens, and I used a special parchment paper that I got from the scrapbooking section. It's a mess. As you can see, it is an absolute mess. And the final draft of the map doesn't look anything like this. It looks a little bit like it, but it's not nearly as messy, and I have things more spaced out, and I have name changes and area changes. So this is just where I kind of started with, and I was like, I need a visual of exactly how things work. As the story progressed, as everything sort of moved along and I knew where my characters were going, I was able to start filling some things in. I had an idea of how the roads worked. I knew the types of routes that they were able to take, and I knew where certain cities were that they couldn't go. So I started filling things in, and this is still not a final draft, but this at least has some of the forests and most of the mountains and the dunes that are important to the story. It starts to fill in things, and you can see that there's still a lot of islands that don't have any names. Those are where the story expands and how I have lots of room. You can see on the continent to the left, it's very barren. So that means either one, I have no story taking place there and I was having to create things just out of my mind, or two, I just have an empty continent. There's nothing there. That's not the case. There actually is some things there. But I still did this on sketchbook paper, and I was able to have established city borders and labels for almost everything. Every quarter, there is an event on Twitter called PitMad. The idea is for writers to pitch their novel ideas. They have to have a completed manuscript that has to be polished and ready to go to an agent. And they have to pitch their book in a single tweet. Sometimes they can have a picture, sometimes they just have a little snippet of the story. There are some really great ones out there, and there are some real duds. I did it once, and I have since started another rewrite and changed how I want to approach my book. But for it, I decided I needed a map, and one of the ladies in my writing group was absolutely wonderful in helping me create a map that I could use for PitMad. It is still not a complete map, but it's so much more fleshed out, and I can look at it and I see, this is my world, this is the world that I created, and I can see so many different places. You can see how it's grown. On the last map, the continent on the left, Alessa, was almost completely empty. There were just a few areas there. But now, as you can see, there's a lot. We've got several cities, several forests. We have the mountains are more filled in, and we have a lot of places that weren't there before. On the right side, you can see that the jungle, which is called the overgrowth, is actually looking like a jungle now. It is covered in trees, and it slowly fades out and enters into the desert area of the Ultari Dunes. You can see the place I referenced earlier, the Betrayer's Rampart, and how it separated the dunes from another area. And this is the best way to really get your story established. If you have a story, I really can't encourage you enough to put it onto a map. Even if you don't have an idea yet of what you want the world to look like or how many continents you have, just start something. Get something on paper. Even if you don't draw outlines and you just put names in a relative place, that's a great start, because you need to know kind of where you're going to progress. And there's a lot of map makers out there. The one I put up earlier is one, but there are so many others that you could go with. There's a lot of different software, and some of it's free, and you could probably even find some books on map making and cartography. There's lots of options. You don't have an excuse. You have a hand and you have a pencil, and you can get some paper and just make a map. It doesn't have to be perfect. No one expects it to be, because this is a world you're creating and you have a lot on your plate. The most important things to take from this, though, don't complicate things. Worlds are surprisingly functional. They are absolutely amazing in the way that they can work, the way that the people and the animals and the plants can adapt. There's no reason to go crazy, out of this world, completely different if you don't feel comfortable. If you're the kind of person who wants to create this completely different world that's absolutely amazing and nothing like our current world, then go for it. Definitely do it. I encourage it. But if you want to create a world that's something that you're familiar with, then do that too. There's no reason to make this harder on you than it already is, because world building is not an easy task. Just do what you know and do it well. Create a foundation and build up from there. Like I said earlier, establish the universe that your world exists in. Have a faith, have some beliefs. Maybe your people worship gods of the sun and the moon. Maybe they worship sea deities. Maybe your entire world is underwater. Maybe they have these hydro tubes for travel, and they are going to worship things that are in the ocean around them. There's a lot of different options, and you need to figure out what's going to make the most sense for your story. So once you build that foundation, once you have something solid, that's where you can build up and out and make your story. You have to have room for your story to grow. Like I said, it starts with one little dream, and then all of a sudden you have a 4-book series, and it just keeps growing from there. There are very few people who have started a world building project knowing that they were going to write 5 to 10 books. They may have just planned one, and then it caught fire. Have a variety of landscapes. You can have tundra, you can have mountains and deserts, you can have so many different environments that are really awesome. Like I said, put in a grotto, they're gorgeous. Put in some wetlands, they have so many different resources and animals. Make your people use peat as a fuel source. Have a lot of variety in your world. Give your characters choices on where to go. Make sure that they have this awesome environment to interact in. Or don't. Make your world really limited. If that's something that you need to do, if that's something that you want to do, or that your story demands, then don't make it something really crazy and have 20 different climates. You don't need that. Find what works for you. Next week is probably going to be a lot more in depth. We're going to be talking about cityscaping, and since there's so many different types of cities and towns, it can get a lot more in depth because now we're starting to work with the actual people and the governments and the religions and everything that functions. The world has a lot of gears that are constantly turning, and a lot of those are in cities. So next week we start on cityscaping, and after that we go into all the little fine details that really cause the lore dumping. So we will talk about that again. If anyone has any questions, this is the show. And next week we'll be starting back on cityscaping. Thank you all for coming, and I hope you all come back next week for the cityscaping. And I feel like we might have some more questions for that because I've already had people who have asked me questions. So I'll try and at least bring some to answer. If anyone ever has questions in between, please feel free to send them to me and I will be happy to answer them. Have a great evening.